Meanwhile, the business of government goes on, but not particularly well. We spoke to you some weeks ago, 2 weeks ago I think it was, 1,700 people were released out of prison all at once, and it turns out that a bunch of wife-beaters were also released who shouldn't have been released, and they're on the run because they were freed early by mistake. That's what the Ministry of Justice says. They're now striving to avoid more ineligible offenders being freed after it emerged that this particular oversight had happened. Let's talk to Danny Shaw, crime policing and justice commentator, right here on Talk. Danny, very good morning to you.
Morning, Mike. Hi there.
I mean, we did predict this, didn't we? I mean, we did say, look, if you do a sort of mass, release of prisoners, you're going to get some prisoners who are released who probably shouldn't be released, and some prisoners who get released won't do the things that you want them to do, and they'll probably disappear.
Yeah, it was entirely predictable, wasn't it, Mike? We know that the criminal justice system is pretty chaotic and not very well run at times, and I think the handling of the prison releases programme has been a bit of a farce, to be honest.
Yeah.
First, we had the news that some prisoners who should have been tagged on release, wearing electronic tags and subject to curfew, actually the tags hadn't arrived. They hadn't ordered enough tags. Then we learned that, some of the prisoners released included a man who'd been jailed for manslaughter. I personally find that absolutely astonishing.
Yeah.
Why manslaughter wasn't specifically excluded from the list of offences for which people couldn't be released. And now we've learned that 37 prisoners were released in error. They were subject to restraining orders, and because of a mix-up over the legislation under which they were sentenced, this wasn't spotted, that they should have been excluded from the scheme. They were released out of the prison gates. We're told that 5 of them are still at large. 5 of them haven't been found, so they're out there. That's a terrible blunder by the Ministry of Justice.
It is. And I mean, one of the things that also was said to be a problem was that a lot of women who had been domestically abused, who had been physically abused by their partners or their boyfriends or whatever, weren't being told whether or not their particular assailant had been released. And I assume that's still the case, that some of these women are walking around today not knowing whether their particular assailant is one of those who's now out.
You would have hoped that, with a number as small as 37, that officials would have got round to telling the victims that the perpetrator had been let out by mistake. But we can't really assume anything. I think what still I don't get about this scheme, I understand the need for it, and we've talked about this before. This was a problem inherited by this government from the previous government, was why they had to release 1,700 in one block.
Yeah.
The manner in which it was done. For example, I've been told that a couple of prisons took the very sensible approach that they wouldn't let all the inmates out that they had to let out in one go. They let them out in twos, so there weren't the scenes of people celebrating, opening bottles of champagne, running around, saying thanks, Keir, and all of that kind of thing. Whereas in other jails, they sort of just let them out in one batch. Now, that strikes me as a sort of an absence of planning, an absence of thought that has gone into this. They did have some time to plan it. It wasn't done overnight. They did have some weeks to do it, and they still got it wrong. We're not talking about 17,000 people being released. We're talking about 1,700. You would have thought there's enough officials at the headquarters of the Ministry of Justice to get this right.
Exactly right. And as we watched, funnily enough, we had a camera, it wasn't our camera, but I think it was a Press Association camera, sitting outside Brixton, HMP Brixton. It was quite remarkable just watching without even having to comment on the fact, and you're seeing it now, of people coming out of prison. It was this kind of bizarre, it was so badly managed, and if you think about the PR around it, some people were coming out sort of covering their faces, other people were coming out looking very happy, other people were, like, as he was, going out to give somebody a hug, other people were walking into the back of a police van. It was almost like a sort of Keystone Cops episode. You just thought, who's come up with all this, and has anybody actually given any thought as to how it's going to look?
Yeah, I mean, there's a communications side of it, an optics side of it, isn't there, which appears not to have sort of been given sufficient thought to this. There is going to be another day next month when there's also going to be a large number of releases in one day, I think around the same number. You would hope that people would have, learnt the lesson and try and do it differently and stage it at least through the day with some early, some later on and so on, to avoid some of those to avoid some of those scenes.
Right.
I mean, the underlying problem here, Mike, is that this isn't going to solve the problem of crowded prisons, because I think this has just bought them around 9 months or so of capacity, and then we're going to be in another situation where there isn't enough space. They may have to continue with the scheme. I don't know whether there's thoughts about expanding it, but that's the really serious concern. And there are reports that ministers are considering a sort of new sentencing style scheme, which would give prisoners in jail time off for good behaviour. This is modelled on something that takes place in Texas, whereby you earn your release. So some prisoners...
It's a loyalty bonus, isn't it?
Sorry, I beg your pardon?
It's a sort of a loyalty bonus scheme, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's nothing wrong with encouraging prisoners while they're in jail to behave well, to help out in the prison, to do prison work, to undertake courses. That's pretty standard. You can earn privileges through good behaviour in prison. The idea of earning your release early in prison, I think, is fraught with difficulties, particularly because we know some prisoners are being released at the 40% mark and some even before that, if they wear an electronic tag. So it's a question of, does it undermine the whole concept of punishment and knowing what your sentence is? You're told your sentence, you're going to spend 2 years in prison. No, you don't spend 2 years in prison. You spend, less than half of that in prison.
Right, and the problem with prisoners, of course, is that they're dishonest by nature. So they're quite good at convincing people, like we've seen many really, really hard and horrible prisoners convincing a parole board that they're OK now and they can be let out, and we've seen the problems that can create. But, they're deceptive, they're manipulative, they're clever, they're not stupid people. They might have got caught for a reason which was outside of their control. But generally speaking, these are not people that you could trust. And so the idea that they're going to kind of pretend to behave well in prison in order to make sure they can get out early is not necessarily going to be something that's good for the rest of the community.
Well, I would be worried about that, because good behaviour in prison isn't necessarily linked to being safe on release, to not presenting a threat to the public on release. So you're absolutely right. There are some prisoners who are so-called model prisoners. They present really well. They do everything that's asked of them, but they're still harbouring perhaps sexual desires involving young people, or they have violent tendencies which really haven't been checked. So there is that concern about the scheme. I should say it's just an idea at the moment, and it's one of those ideas that's likely to be looked at by the sentencing review, which the Ministry of Justice is going to announce, I think, in the next couple of months. Yeah,
I mean, it's funny that Labour are starting to look abroad for certain sort of ideas in the prison and the penal system, because Texas, one would have thought, is not the kind of place that the Labour government would want to copy much from, because one of the things they're famous for is execution in Texas, right? They murdered more people. Executed more people than any other state since the death penalty was reintroduced in 1982. 590 people have been killed by lethal injection in the last 40 years. In fact, I seem to remember George Bush, shortly before he became president, George W. Bush this is, shortly before he became president when he was governor of Texas, had a sort of mass execution scenario going on just before he went into the White House, where he killed, I think, 300 people in 1 year. Or something ridiculous, So I'm not sure that Texas is necessarily the great answer penally that they think it is.
I don't think they're going to be copying that idea, but Texas also had a huge problem with prison overcrowding, with so many people going to prison, not enough prison places, similar to here, that they've introduced this sort of earned early release scheme. So, look, there's nothing wrong with looking at other ideas, thinking outside the box. And that will be put into the mix, I'm sure, along with some other ideas, for example, abolishing short prison sentences, which has been on the agenda for some time. I think, the concern about short prison sentences is that prison sentences are often handed out as a last resort to someone where you've tried everything else, and at the end of the day, they have to go to prison. And they're also there as to give society a break from them, quite frankly. So I think you've got to be very careful about reaching for solutions to cure a problem that, perhaps demands a complete rethink about sentencing or just ramping up capacity.
Yeah, absolutely right. Good to talk to you, Danny. Thanks very much indeed. Danny Shaw there, crime policing and justice commentator. He used to be Home Secretary Yvette Cooper's advisor, by the way, before she was the Home Secretary, when she was the shadow Home Secretary.